Thank you very much, John, and I appreciate you folks having me out here today. Warm welcome, and I appreciate all our partners tuning in remotely. Tremendously excited to be here today to talk about innovation, what it means to transform your organization through change, and how we can succeed in the new operating reality. But before we begin, and I hope your event marketing team isn't going to lynch me for this one, obviously we heard, shut off cell phones, shut off mobile devices, tablets. If you have a pager, you can throw that in the trash and upgrade. It is the 21st century now. But that said, I'm actually going to ask you to turn those suckers on, if you don't mind, if you happen to have a smartphone, mobile device, because I'd love for the world to hear how EMC approaches innovation. And I thought today we might redefine what it means to innovate and to disrupt. So if you're on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, please, by all means, take photos, share status updates, share it with the world. Although if we catch you playing Angry Birds, you will be ejected from the venue. So just keep that in mind. Now that said, as we take a look at what it means to be a disruptive innovator, I stumbled across a recent example as I was doing research for a new book, and I thought it was perfect. So I wanted to share that with you today. It really cuts to the crux of what we're talking about when it comes to innovation. So over at Royal Dutch Shell, or Shell as you may know them here in the US, you've got a global market-leading energy provider that sells about 3 million barrels of oil every year and exports about 20 million barrels of natural gas to dozens of countries worldwide. So realistically, probably not the first place you would expect to find employees starting a fire, let alone deliberately. But at Shell, they have a leadership training program called Empower, whose specific mandate is to spark leaders' imagination to life and set their ability to innovate ablaze. But what was curious to me, as I spoke to Mandar Apte, the gentleman who heads up the program, is that it's not rooted in traditional processes or procedures. And in fact, the Empower program is actually based on a simple principle, and that principle is teaching tomorrow's leaders that celebrating tradition is not about worshiping the ashes, but rather finding ways to constantly tend and rekindle the flame. In other words, to get back in touch with that spirit of entrepreneurship and innovation that brought you this far as an organization and as a professional. So as they've gone about the process of preparing literally hundreds of employees to face tomorrow's business challenges, things like rising risk and uncertainty, changing economic environments, one of the most surprising discoveries that they made is that some of the biggest, most pressing business problems that we face aren't really rooted in the issues that we suspect. It's not a lack of budget, it's not a lack of ideas or imagination, but many times they're simply rooted in a resistance to change and a lack of appetite for risk tolerance. So as a result, Apte and his colleagues have taken a surprisingly counterintuitive approach to teaching Shell executives how to solve problems. And unlike traditional approaches, where you focus outward, where you look externally at the source of the problem and some of the issues that you're facing, this one actually begins by taking a look internally and taking a hard look in the mirror, both on an organizational, enterprise-wide, and individual level. So curious to me, what really struck me as I talked to Apte is that going into these Empower leadership training sessions, he just assumes that every Shell executive in the room is capable of being an innovator. And he argues that every single individual is constantly adapting and evolving on a daily basis. Now, I don't know if you looked at your schedule or your BlackBerry this morning or your iPhone, but you may discover that you're running surgery on it constantly, right? Business world is fast moving, constantly changing, so we're all innovating and adapting each and every single day. So if that's the case, if we're all innovators, it's no surprise that he asks a simple question going into every single class, and that is, if we are all innovators, what in the hell is stopping us from doing so? Why aren't we innovating? And what they found is that oftentimes the only thing preventing us from succeeding or getting ahead or being more creative is our sense of perspective. So as we come here to celebrate innovation, I would urge you to ask yourself that question. But I would also urge you to ask yourself the second question that he puts to his students as well, and that is, if we know what's inhibiting us, if we know what those inhibitions are, and we are all capable of innovating them, what skills, behaviors, attitudes, habits do we need to be cultivating in order to overcome these obstacles? So I don't think it's any secret that business today is always on, right? It's happening everywhere, every day. It's globalized, it's 24/7, it's connected. We've seen tons of advances over the last several years, let alone the last decades, in areas like research, communications, of course, IT, and big data. But really, the issue from a business perspective is that what many of these advancements have served to do is to commoditize information. And more so, they've served to commoditize many vendors. So the issue is, today, when you look at these advancements that have been spearheaded by the rise of the internet and mobile devices, the problem is that in many cases, whatever you're searching for, could be a supplier, a strategic partner, is just a click or call away. And I'll give you a good example. If you happen to be on your smartphone right now, you can look at app stores, right, like the Apple App Store or Google Play, and you can see that they have roughly 900,000 individual apps in each one of these. And many of them are 5-star rated. And many of them are also getting buried in the shuffle. But what's curious is, if you were to look a little closer, you would see that even in these app stores that have nearly 1 billion software products to choose from, roughly 25 developers, just 25, generate about half of each app store's revenue. So clearly, even in the most fast-moving, crowded, and competitive markets, tremendous competitive advantage and tremendous value and visibility accrues to the most innovative, value-adding solutions from the customer's perspective and the most trusted and differentiated. But I do want to point out one thing, and you're not going to hear this often from a technology analyst and futurist, but to me, technology is just a tool in many ways. It's a platform, an enabler, if you will. And if you've fixed any problems lately, and believe me, I had to fix, I think, roughly 3 dozen before my wife would let me out of the house to come here. It's important to pick the right tool, right? Tools like EMC provides us for cloud security, IT infrastructure, big data, storage. But just as important as picking the right tool for the job is making sure we know when, where, and how to use it to best effect. So curiously, as we take a look at some of the problems that we face, I thought it might be interesting to take a little bit of a step back, if you'll indulge me, and rethink what it means to innovate and what it means when we talk about disruption. And of all the buzzwords that are used in business today, we know that innovation and disruption are among 2 of the most commonly utilized, right? But I also think they're 2 of the most commonly misunderstood. And if you were to look in the dictionary, I think you'd be surprised at what you would find in terms of definitions. And lo and behold, I did. And if you look in Merriam-Webster's, what you'll see is that innovation is simply defined as the introduction of something new. Could be a new product, could be a new service, could simply be a new idea or concept. And disruption is simply defined as a disturbance or a problem that interrupts current events, or a disturbance or problem that throws the normal routines into chaos. So if we take another step back, from a business perspective, really I think what we're talking about when we talk about disruption are simply novel and unforeseen difficulties. And when we talk about innovation, realistically, we're simply talking about creative and resourceful approaches to issues like productivity and problem solving. Now, the irony, despite the reverence with which we hold these terms and you see them splashed across the headlines, is that in over a decade of consulting with the world's biggest businesses and brands, I have yet to see any organization to which these problems were unfamiliar. So issues like changing competitive spectrums, changing trends, that growing risk, that growing uncertainty, having to do more with less, these are not unknown quantities, let alone the innovations or disruptions that they usher in. And the good news is, over that self-same decade, I've yet to encounter an organization or an individual that was patently incapable of changing or evolving to deal with these problems, or, in other words, applying core principles of innovation. Now, every year, Booz & Company runs an annual study where they look at hundreds of the world's top innovators. They call it the Global Innovation 1000. And what really struck me about this study, when they look at what makes companies like 3M, Google, and Amazon tick, is that they found that they don't necessarily spend more money attacking these problems or more time or manpower. Rather, they simply have in place a better support and communications framework for nurturing and incubating new ideas. Really what we're talking about is that they employ systems that make brainstorming new ideas, strategizing new ideas, and actually bringing them to life a lot easier, more cost-effective, and a lot more powerful. Tools and platforms like EMC provides. And I think it's important to note, as part of this study, that even tech leaders in the consumer electronics space, highly fast-moving, highly contested, companies like GE and Samsung, even for them, innovation seldom happens overnight, and it's seldom a series of big breakthroughs. Usually what you have are a series of small wins that eventually snowball and add up to huge victories. But perhaps the most eye-opening finding of this study, and most head-slapping one as well, is that the single #1 source of innovation is simply listening to your customers. And what that would tell me is that everyday frontline employees, the people out there closest to clients on a day-to-day basis, would be those, in most cases, best poised to spot rising trends and rising opportunities, and then to go out and apply novel and fresh approaches to problem solving and innovative strategies to addressing these changing needs. So as an organization, I think it's very important to ask ourselves, are we doing everything that we can to empower and support our colleagues? And on an individual level, getting back to what Apta said over at Empower, we have to ask ourselves, how consistently, how confidently, and how capably are we actually bringing these new and novel solutions and approaches to bear on a day-to-day running basis? So what's also curious to me is just how seriously you folks here at EMC take these core principles of innovation, right? We know that the innovation roadmap provides a pipeline for new ideas and new innovations, and not just breakthrough radical innovations, but incremental as well, evolutionary and revolutionary. And thank you, by the way, Calvin and the team. I really do appreciate your commitment here. What's amazing to me is, yes, we had 4,000 submissions this year for the innovation contest, but thanks to the ingenuity of you and your peers and your insights as well, and your own initiative, because in many cases, EMC employees are taking the ball and running with it of their own time and their own volition. Even ideas that aren't technically winners are quickly being staffed, resourced, and brought to life. Now, a lot of organizations attack the issue of innovation differently, and I thought it might be fun to see the diverse ways that they do it, because many of them are actually rooted in the same core principles that you folks are applying each and every day. So, as an example, you may be familiar with Merck, leading pharmaceutical giant, right? These guys make medicines like Claritin, skincare products like Coppertone. And when I spoke with them, what really stayed with me is the fact that when it comes to some of their most innovative, forward-thinking programs, they don't necessarily assign leadership of them to the individuals who are most qualified on paper. Because what they found is, being in the sciences and being a market leader, on a global scale, they've got a tremendous wealth of talent. This is a business filled with brainiacs and overachievers. So looking on a worldwide basis, the performance and capabilities gap between any given performer isn't that great. So now when it comes to some of their most strategic and forward-thinking programs, what they actually do is they assign it not only to the individuals who are qualified for the job, but those who are most incited and enthusiastic and energized about these programs. They actually take the time to figure out what employees would like to be working on. They file that away, and when projects come up, they pair them with those passions. Now, mind you, I should point out we're not talking about the drugs. They still leave that to the world-class scientific talent, so don't worry about growing a third arm or a vestigial tail anytime soon. And if you look at FedEx, these guys have an interesting situation as well. So here's a business whose corporate culture is fundamentally rooted in entrepreneurship and innovation, nearly single-handedly invented its category, the overnight courier service. 330,000 employees worldwide. But they have a 35 to 40-person team whose goal is specifically to drive game-changing innovation. And what's stunning, if you speak with them, if you ever get the chance to chat, you would find out that their #1 problem is not getting management buy-in. It's not actually getting the resources, the manpower, or the budget to create these game-changing innovations and put these programs into practice. They actually tell me that it's simply inciting employees to speak up, to share their ideas, and to actually turn those ideas into action. Because at the end of the day, they're constantly looking for ways to please, delight, and create value for their customer. And we already know who's closest to the customers and who's best poised to listen to them. Now, over at Intuit, these guys are a personal software finance maker. Some of you may use them to file your taxes. And by the way, if you're here in the States, a little overdue in most cases. But they take it one step further. Their co-founders actually say the role of leadership is no longer simply to lay out strategy and vision, but actually It's to remove the speed bumps in experimenters' way, in their own words. So they make it as quick, as easy, as cost-effective as possible for employees to not only brainstorm new ideas and find people to staff them and collaborate with them on it, but they actually use these online sharing and curation tools and collaboration tools so that employees can deploy these ideas, pilot programs, prototypes in real-world environments, and do it in many cases without actually seeking management or legal approval. And what's amazing to me is that over 30 revenue-generating products and features have resulted from these efforts. Now, I don't know how many lawsuits have been generated by these efforts either, but that said, it's neither here nor there. So, as you can clearly see, every day, everywhere the world over, in dozens of industries worldwide, talented and gifted individuals such as yourself are helping drive the wheels of forward progress and driving innovation forward. And let me tell you why I'm thankful for this as well. So IBM recently published a study. It's called Making Change Work. And what they found, surprise, surprise, is that there is no more day-to-day operating reality. There is no status quo. And in fact, change is the new normal. And what's amazing to me is that 7 years roughly into a recession, depending on where you live and are tuning in from for today, is that in many ways it's more normal than it is new. The question is whether or not we're willing to accept that. And what they did when they talked to hundreds of the world's top innovators, leading companies in every country, they found that 4 out of 5 CEOs actually felt that radical change, massive change, was going to rock their organization and rock their industry in just the next 3 years. But just a fraction of those self-same CEOs actually felt their organizations had the capabilities to deal with that kind of change. Which is very striking because I think we all know that change is hitting us constantly, right? More often, harder, and from more angles than ever before. It's kind of like the intense gusts of winds that buffet your home during a rainstorm, right? And we all know what happens when that home starts to get a little bit weathered. After a while, your roof is going to develop some leaks. And what they found was that innovation is really the only way to patch those leaks. And getting out in front of the curve, using innovation, is akin to actually throwing up a shiny new pair of storm shutters so you can prevent yourself from being rocked by the raging storm that's happening in the market outside. Now, what's also curious is that they discovered, like Shell did, is that mainly success does not hinge on processes or procedures, it hinges on people. And in fact, also important to note is that the top 20% of innovators, this is pretty shocking, they were successful at change management efforts 80% of the time. So 4 out of every 5 times they attempted to introduce a new program and move forward, they were successful. This is twice the success rate of the average performer and more than 10 times the success rate of the lowest 20th percentile. So what that tells me is clearly our ability to manage the so-called unmanageable and deal with unforeseen difficulties and circumstances has a major impact on the bottom line. And in fact, what you're seeing up here is what IBM calls the DNA of the future enterprise. So they also found, like I was saying, with the success rooted in people, is that many times the top innovators and the most successful organizations at change management really boasted just 4 simple, straightforward characteristics. And when each of them was used in tandem, it was tremendously powerful. It greatly magnified the odds that they would succeed. And number 1, just to recap, would be real insights and actions. In other words, these individuals and organizations had a complete, total, and realistic understanding of the challenges and complexities that they faced, so they could strategize around it. Number 2, they also had sound methodologies in place. So it wasn't just about innovating for innovation's sake. They actually had a very practical, systematic approach to innovation and problem solving that was closely tied to real-world, tangible, measurable results. And they were also closely aligned with formal project management methodology. So we're not talking about going off in left field here, right? We have to work within the organization's capabilities. Now, number 3, they also had better skills and strategies in place. So these organizations were much more effective at deploying resources to fuel these innovative products, much more effective at assigning dedicated leaders to manage them and get management approval and buy-in. But most importantly, they were more effective at empowering employees to speak up, to turn ideas into action, and actually spark lasting, meaningful change. And of course, last but not least, They also played a portfolio of smart investments. They took smart risks. So they operated their innovation organization and their teams much like you would a financial portfolio. Not every investment was going to pay off, but they made a series of small bets and big bets as well. And in the aggregate, they knew that some would take, and they hoped that it would gain. So these organizations actually had a better understanding of the risk-reward scenario. And this allowed them to minimize costs, minimize exposure, maximize the odds of success, and maximize the potential payout and windfalls on the back end when they hit. Now, noticeably not listed on IBM's list of characteristics were more money, more time to throw at the problem, better talent, brighter ideas, more resources. So I thought that was pretty telling. Now, when it comes to successfully leading through change, I do think it's important to remember a few things. And number one is that individuals stay relevant through constant reinvention. If you happen to be a U2 fan, take a look how Bono looks and sounds today versus how he did 40 years ago. And I promise you it's different, and it is not just the Botox. Now, number two, the other thing that we should remember here is that, as we just talked about, successful organizations get that way because they take smart risks, they make smart investments, and they play that portfolio of bets with their innovation strategy. And of course, number three, we know that companies like EMC give us all the tools and infrastructure that we need to spark lasting positive change. But also number four, we know that you and only you can give your organization the perspective, the platforms, and most importantly, the permission that it needs to bring that creativity to life and spark innovation to life. So just to touch on one last thing before I leave you today. We spoke about this earlier, but essentially innovation can come in two forms. There's breakthrough and there's incremental, right? There's revolutionary and there's evolutionary. So really, when you're tackling innovation, you get a couple choices from a tactical standpoint. You can take a shotgun strategy, throw everything against the wall, see what sticks. Or you can pick a carefully defined key target and aim very deliberately from afar. And I got to tell you, both are effective in different scenarios, but both are much more powerful when they're used in tandem. So ultimately, what you're trying to do is not necessarily hit the bullseye on every shot. But what you are trying to do is gain better coverage over your entire spread of targets to create the firing range effect. And that way, when you do that, you maximize the odds that you're eventually going to beam your target right between the eyes. And when you do that, that you're going to pound that sucker home to devastating impact. So that being said, as I leave you here today, I truly urge you to remember that each and every one of us, like Apta pointed out, is an innovator. You, me, he, she, everybody tuning in today. So if that's the case, we all have the obligation and the responsibility, both to ourselves and to our organizations, to bring those unique insights and those unique abilities to bear to the benefit of all involved. So just to wrap it up, I want to tell you the power to innovate is absolutely yours, as you've seen here through some of the many examples today. And the time and the place to do it are definitely here and now. In fact, if I had my druthers, many people would have been doing a decade ago. Here at EMC, I'm proud to say we're several years in. So that said, I'm confident that working together, we can all create that positive and lasting change. And I got to tell you, I genuinely look forward to seeing what the future brings, both from EMC as well as all of its valued clients and partners. So thank you very much for having me here today.